page.
Sounds about right. Meeting is now streaming live on YouTube. I'm bad at talking.
That's a fundamental lie.
I'm bad at forming words. The ideas are all there. It's like the literal pronunciation of the words. That's
Okay, so we are officially live. I'm going to give us 1 minute before we show our beautiful faces. And I can post the proper link onto the social medias. I'm also really glad that whatever my voice was becoming has now become immortalized. But yes, I don't know what, just Griffin McElroy haunts me. So, sleep paralysis.
I like that without context being the first idea that is submitted to the live stream.
Mm-hmm.
I think that sparks joy.
I think that the masses should know.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, yeah, never mind. I'll continue my feelings about Griffle. Is his new name?
I mean, I feel like everyone who's going to tune in, if they haven't heard your feelings about Griffin McElroy yet, I'm sure they will soon. Be a nice and free person.
Exactly. Okay, it is officially 6:02, so we can show our lovely faces. And you can hear Ghosty in the background. So I think most people know who I am. In case you don't, my name is Sophie. I am a choreographer and a writer, and I'm here to talk over my dog with one of my favorite people in the world. Jamari, do you wanna tell us who you are?
No.
Oh.
I'm Jamari. I am a they and also a them. I am a writer, and I have too many opinions about things that don't super matter.
Yeah, so we're here to talk about storytelling, which I feel like is the main thing that you and I always talk about. It kind of doesn't matter what topic of conversation we've started with, it always comes back to our favorite stories. So before we get into sort of like nitty-gritty concepts, I just want to ask a few kind of easy questions. The first being, what are your favorite stories and why?
Hey. That's kind of a huge question for me because
That's why I said easy in quotation marks.
So let me give a sampling. Probably my favorite movie of all time is 2001: A Space Odyssey. It is one of the slowest movies ever made, and inexplicably every single frame of it delights me. Then, as anyone who's had a conversation with me in the past year might know, my favorite TV show of all time is The Untamed. And God, what's my favorite book? Do I have one right now?
That's honestly the hardest answer.
I don't know. I'm not going to dig into that. Favorite story podcast is the first season of The Adventure Zone, but I like the other seasons. The stories I like tend to be gay.
Shocking.
We're
all shocked.
And they also tend to just beat you with themes. Like they're coming in and they have something to say. And what I found, the things I tend to like, they are things where they have so much to say that if I've ever interacted with a fandom of the things that I like, I am there for an entirely different reason that like the vocal fandom is, and so then I don't interact. Especially because so much of what I like is gay and straight women, you know?
Oh, we're gonna talk about that.
I'm sure it'll come up a few times. But yeah, so I really like, I'm a slut for an extended metaphor. My favorite writer is Toni Morrison. if you like hit me with a theme and just keep punching me in the face with it for a few hours, like I'm good. As long as it's a theme I like.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there are a few themes that if you got punched in the face with, you might be actually, not pumped about. I mean, I feel like they're for all of us. um, yeah, okay. So I will also answer this question in a second, but before I hop into my answers, what genres do you tend to gravitate towards?
So my favorite genre of anything is wuxia, which is a genre that is quite exclusive to China. I don't know. I know Sophie hasn't seen it, but Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon is probably the most famous wuxia movie in the West. So wuxia, which I am not pronouncing because I'm speaking English and doing tones in English. No, thank you. I speak some Chinese. Anyway, wuxia is pretty much low fantasy. Like it is a martial arts movie that is very concerned with like themes about morality and like about society and about like what makes a good person and what makes a good citizen and who's how to be the best at punching people really hard. So it's like it always has like this wild mix of action. So wuxia, you would recognize it because that's when you're seeing a martial arts movie and everyone's flying for some reason. Wuxia. So a wuxia is always an epic fucking journey, even if you were to read like the synopsis for the story and you're thinking this probably isn't going to be an epic journey, it is. It's super dramatic. Everything is heightened. And it's themes on themes on themes on themes because many wuxia stories are about they're sort of following the canon of like classical Chinese literature and like myths and legends. So those kinds of stories that are very grand, even if they're in a very small scale, like if they feel grand, basically they have a shit ton of emotional stakes. I'm in. But I do have to have the buy-in of liking the characters because I'm a character bitch, and if I don't like the characters, I'm out. And if something's quite bad and I do like the characters, it might keep me.
Oh yeah. My favorite thing in the world is when you tell me about shows that you like the way you'll start a sentence is like, I hate this, but here's like my whole deep dive into why I'm so invested in these characters.
Yeah, I'm watching like 5 different shows right now, and I actively enjoy 2 of them.
Oh no. That's real. As for myself, I feel like you and I have some crossover, but not in this, like I don't think that our favorite things cross over in like what the thing is, does that make sense? So my favorite films, I have 2 that are tied, are The Witch by Robert Eggers and Ex Machina by Alex Garland.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And those for me, my partner actually asked a while ago, like if one outranks the other, and for me, not really. One, The Witch is a film that I could talk about for 12 years in the way that it handles its themes, in the actual structuring, especially the script structuring, like the dialect is everything to me. But it's like like I have a really intense like emotional connection to The Witch. And Ex Machina is a film where I feel like I can spend years like using academic sources to tear it apart and put it back together. So it's a little bit more of like a heady love. I actually like if you're gonna go for an Alex Garland film that just like emotionally is it for me, I would say Annihilation. But that's a lot less accessible given that it's just like straight science fiction cosmic horror. And that's my thing. And Ex Machina is a lot more character driven. I don't know if I have a favorite book. Well, that's actually not true. That's a lie, and everyone who knows me knows that's a lie. My favorite book is Frankenstein. Shocked.
Literally, Ex Machina is Frankenstein.
It's Frankenstein, but 2018. And that's it, or 2016, I guess. I think everyone should check it out just for Oscar Isaac's beard.
I was gonna say I think it's worth it to see the context of that one dance scene.
The dance scene, oh my god, you don't need context for the Ex Machina dance scene. My favorite.
But the context is so good
It's so much better.
It's even more incomprehensible.
So bonkers. I love it. I don't know if I have a favorite TV show because my favorite TV shows have done me dirty. The two TV shows that were like my all-time favorite for story and characters were Penny Dreadful, which you introduced me to, and Game of Thrones. And I would love to tear both of them apart in this live stream because they both did the exact same bad writing in the final seasons.
Yeah, I just wrote that down so we don't forget to talk about when stories betray the viewer.
When stories betray us and we get really angry. Yeah, and then with podcasts, I don't listen to a lot of narrative podcasts. I listen to a few. Something I need to get more into. I said a few. Don't give me that look. We all know I listen to one. Which if you haven't heard of the Magnus Archives, you should listen to it. But I do tend to listen to more like history podcasts. That's sort of my favorite thing. I would say my favorite, or true crime. History and true crime tend to be where I go to for podcasts, or where like podcasts tend to be where I go to for history and true crime. I would say my personal favorites of those for the way that they tell the story would probably be Noble Blood with Dana Schwartz, which is about macabre imperialist history. And she tells it in a very like linear and narrative fashion without pretending like monarchs are good people. So that's fun. And she does cover mostly European monarchs, but she covers non-European monarchs, which in a lot of my history experience, they just don't get covered. So I would recommend Noble Blood. And then also same network, Aaron Mahnke's Unobscured. Lore is great, like lore is awesome, but Unobscured is a 12-part series, and each season is a different topic. I recommend first and foremost the first season, which is about the Salem witch trials. And it is, in my experience as someone who is very fascinated with witch burnings and just that whole shindig, it is the most comprehensive single spot that I have found outside of a book. So if sitting down and reading like a history book isn't something you're interested in, I would recommend Unobscured. And he tells that in a very similar way to the way lore is structured, which is just him with some pretty string or instruments behind him, just telling you a story in his borderline.
So I will say he is a liar. And when I say he's a liar, I don't mean he's feeding us direct lies. I mean, in the context of his story, the number of episodes of lore where he says no pun intended, Aaron Mahnke,
always a pun intended.
Show is scripted.
There is every single episode there is a pun. Yeah, no, he's and I can't tell you how many you shouldn't, because his puns are also horrible. They're really bad. And I respect him. He is my podcast father. Yeah. So those are some of our favorites. Oh, and my favorite genre, this is really going to surprise anyone who's been listening for the last 5 minutes, is horror. And my comfort genre is high fantasy. So if I don't really want to feel much or like want to feel cozy, I'm going to read something with dragons in it. That's sort of, which is one of the many reasons Game of Thrones did me dirty. They took my dragons from me. Oh. So Jamari, we've touched on a lot of stuff just in the last 5 minutes. Is there anything you kind of want to start with?
I don't know. What were the topics that were submitted?
So a few things we can talk about. We talked about when stories betray us, just here in the last few minutes. Theme, and how theme is dealt with, and or themes that we have emotional connections to. In my sort of notes over here, we've also talked about diversity in storytelling and how to create characters with identities that are not our own. And then also what kind of stories that we find ourselves telling and how we tell those stories. Just to name a few. Those are all huge topics.
I've just decided in my heart that I kind of want to take like a beginning to end approach to this. Because if we get started on when stories do us dirty now, that's it. That's what we're talking about for the next 2 hours.
Talking about for the next 12 years.
And then I feel like if we're going to be talking about stories, like that kind of topic makes sense to both of us talking about it because we talk about stories every day. But I kind of want to start at like a more basic place before like we got to set up what the contract of a story is before we talk about what happens when the creators break it or otherwise disrespect it.
Yeah, I'm down with that.
And then also, as you brought up, I just want to say, like, I have a passion for storytelling, and so it's not just fiction, right? There's the way that we tell history stories, how nonfiction is approached. There's the way, you know, biographies are told. There's also mediums on mediums on mediums. There's video games. We brought up podcasts, TV, movies. There's dance. There's music. And then there's the, you know, stories that will use a bunch of them. In fact, I mean, most stories have music in them because if they don't have music, like our human brain goes, I'm just watching nothing. This is nothing.
There is one film I can think of that doesn't have like a traditional score, and it's No Country for Old Men. And I remember actively kind of being like, because all of the other sounds are so enhanced that I was like actively taken aback.
Yeah. But like from the front end of things, like in the like basis of like the setup of a story, I think I want to talk about like how we like approach that setup and how we like look at setups in media in setting up different kinds of stories.
Well, you and I have very different approaches to our storytelling. So how do you start a project?
Characters.
Yep.
I start with characters. I tell stories about people. The plot is secondary. So even one of the main projects I'm working on right now, I have kind of two because I don't have a lot of ideas. I have big ideas. And so I'll be like, all right, here's my little project. And suddenly it's 20 books long. But on one of them, it's very much something where even though it's not so much that the plot is being directly pulled from the decisions and actions of the characters, most of the story is in the reactions. So I don't like to spend a lot of time in the setup. Right? Like a thing happens. So there's one story I have where it's just things happening at these people and them reacting to it. And most of the time is spent in the reactions and the recoveries.
Yeah.
Because that's sort of where I'm interested. And so when I'm starting from the front end of that, I might have a vague concept, but whatever that concept is, I will say, okay, what kind of characters would I put within this situation? And I then proceed to ignore the concept and flesh out the characters, and then they give me a new concept. So the concept that I started with that birthed the characters never has literally anything to do with the concept that the characters then spit out back at me. But I spend a lot of time on characters. I know too much about them. Yeah, characters. Your turn.
So I am the complete opposite. I am concept and theme heavy in all of my work. So basically and that is, I think, definitely because of specifically my horror background. Horror over time has mainly been theme, concept, insert people into this horrific situation. There are other versions of horror where you can tell like characters are a lot more fleshed out. But most like in most horror films, horror novels, it's people put into horrific things. So for me, I tend to come up with a concept or an idea. I also tend to be a short story writer, and then I am also a choreographer. So deciding what the concept or idea, like which medium will serve it better or serve it best, is something I have to think about. But like, okay, so what? Most of my short stories, I've one about a queen who is presented with a severed head as a of her new husband's, the king's, like, biggest enemy, and it begins to talk to her. And the way that I kind of figured out that story was I had a friend who said, I have been reading about corpse magic and some of these different ideas around prophecy. Make me a thing. And so from that point, I was like, okay, here's some ideas that you can use a talking head for. And she liked the one about the queen. And then I just, once I had the kind of idea, the setup, started thinking about what themes could be used. Themes I was going for, don't know if they're potentially as strong as I want them to be, are sort of anxieties around motherhood, anxieties about, not anxieties, but there is something that, as I mentioned earlier, being an enthusiast of monarch history, the concept of the divine right of kings is disturbing in its essence. So that's something that I also wanted to play with, and then had to create characters that would be living in that setting. So characters tend to be the last thing that happens.
Yeah. So I've read the head story. I love the head story, but very much your characters are the themes.
Yes.
That's what they are. Like they're not people with agency in this world. They are mouthpieces for the theme. And that kind of sounds like a dig, and it's important people know it's not a dig.
I also know from having spoken to you about our writing that it's not. And it's one thing that I also want to say, my current writing project, Jamari, has been like the main voice in my head because I am working on a novel where I'm trying to use your characters first method, and it's kicking me right in the head.
I mean, for you, because I'm still getting through that fucking novella you sent me. It's a lovely novella, but you're like, oh yeah, I have a short story I sent you, and it's like 30,000 words. That's a novella. But as with that one, it's very, very theme heavy. But like the story you mentioned, it's something where you're saying, as I'm reading it, I'm like, I need the characters here. Where it's different from the head story, where as I'm reading it, I don't need the characters, because what really matters is the most interesting thing here is the head and what it's saying, and then like the subtext, whatever.
Subtext could just be straight up text.
Or the text, the literal
there's
things.
Definitely
the head
some.
Is just like, here's what I just said. Beat you over the head with the theme of this story. Or like every time I read something of you, I Google the characters' names because their name directly correlates to the theme that they represent.
Yeah.
But in thinking of like the approaches, like if we're thinking about the head story, you came through that of concept, themes, people. And so I'm thinking, like, if I was telling the same story, I would have done concept, I would have done people. And then I think it's also different as we're moving from conceptualizing the story into like the way that the story is told. Mm-hmm. You're very like, it's very, very much what you would see in like a horror movie, right? Where they don't have much to actually say, but the things that they are saying are about the themes. Mm-hmm. Or the things that they're thinking are the themes, and the things that they're saying are the sort of mundanities that are enveloping them. Whereas for me and how I approach things, if I were to take that similar setup, most of the story would be about the emotions
Yeah.
and not about the thing itself. And that's kind of like
reading your stories, I feel like I'm reading about like living people more so like that are engaging with a world than I feel like I'm reading about a world, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Because like, listen, I spend a lot of time on the world, but like ultimately.
Oh yeah. My favorite thing ever is when you send me notes and notes of like, this is the lore, and I'm just like. Also, I kind of want to talk a little bit about engagement with genre, because you are always 30 seconds from being a cosmic horror writer. And what I think is really interesting is most genres tend to have themes that are pretty common in them. I feel like if you were to pick like, okay, horror tends to deal with personhood, bodily trauma. There's a lot more that can go into it. Modern horror tends to be grief, intergenerational trauma, stuff like that. Again, much more within that fantasy. You can get good versus evil. You can get fighting for like a piece of land, whether it be the Shire or something. Sci-fi, I mean, my problem is my engagement with sci-fi is always sci-fi horror. So the first thing I go to is it tends to also be about personhood. But what I love about your writing is you have these characters that are dealing with very specific issues that are related to the world that they're in. And then the world itself pulls in this theme that is like from another genre. And that to me is like a someone who's like, okay, can you really quickly explain the dimensional aspect of your stories, because that's what I'm talking about.
Right, the like the in-between place.
Yeah,
all
that's
of that.
like eating the world.
Yeah, so in this one of the main universes I'm writing in, pretty much it's kind of a multiverse. It's sort of like a D&D sort of multiverse, where lots of different dimensions, but then there's also the more science fiction-y aspect of it, where there's like the literal, like, now you're in the fourth dimensional space, now you're in the, all of that. So it's sort of all these different dimensions of the world that are sort of clustered together in part of one thing. And what is happening to them is they are being undone by a big force of darkness that is literally dematerializing everything. And it's not that it's destroying it, it's that it's dematerializing it. It looks black to people because what's happening in this cloud is completely incomprehensible to us. But the idea is that it's sort of part of a cycle where once the thing is dematerialized, it's supposed to become a new thing. But that's not happening anymore because, oops, we spilled our dematerializer into the thing that drives the rematerializing, and now it's just cannibalizing itself. So yeah, the universe is cannibalizing itself and becoming something entirely incomprehensible. And it has been for a really long time. And
for anyone who is not like versed in cosmic horror, that right there is kind of like the essence of cosmic horror. Cosmic horror was popularized by our least favorite human, Howard Philip Lovecraft. The person who every single person who's like, I like cosmic horror, but let me give a 10-minute rant on why you should just always dunk on Lovecraft. And his themes really were about the, like, an outside force coming in and
no, like, I do need to say, contextualize this. His themes were about how much he hated.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say his themes were xenophobia. Just like hardcore. But the way he sort of explained it was an outside force, usually aliens, coming in and ruining a character's way of life. H.P. Lovecraft is a hardcore racist, pretty much not, there's like nothing about him as a human being that is redeemable. He's just a bad dude. What I love about cosmic horror is these themes of having your personhood or your way of life like torn from you was then taken specifically by queer people and specifically Black people and went, this is ours now. You don't get to have it, Howard. And those themes have changed and evolved, and a lot of cosmic horror, the easiest way to get people to see that like this thing is pulling us from ourselves, whether that thing is capitalism, it's usually capitalism, or like that's like the big theme tends to be. There's lots and lots. I will spam some really great cosmic horror boys in the chat here in a bit. And that's like not like it is, but isn't like you. What I love about your story is it's not horrifying.
Mm-mm.
In the same way that cosmic horror makes you go, this is scary. This is something you as a reader should fear.
Yeah. So, and I think that's down into the whole conception of it, like we were talking, because when it was brought to my attention within the past year that I was writing very close to cosmic horror. I've been working in this particular universe for over 10 years. And just never noticed, because to me, cosmic horror is not horrifying. Mm-hmm. And so in the concept of this world, the even like the idea that everything is tiny and meaningless and there's always going to be something bigger than you that can take it away without even noticing, who cares? Like,
yeah.
Like, oh, a big giant horror could come and accidentally slam into our planet. And oh my God, we're all so tiny. How fucking so could a dedicated asteroid. Like, I don't like, to me, like, it's difficult for me to wrap my head around what makes cosmic horror horrifying, because to me and my understanding of it, kind of a lot of the basis of it is also in sort of that like existential crisis. Yeah. And I've also never had one of those. Because like the way that I see everything, I remember even as a young child, I'd look up into the stars and be like, it is so vast and we are so tiny, and it's like amazing. Mm-hmm. And it was news to me that other people found that concerning. Like, I'm like, how, if everything is meaningless, we can do what we want. Like, this is lit, guys.
Yeah, so what I really love, that like I can read your work and get something from a theme or a concept that I feel like I'm pretty well versed in. Like I've experienced the thing that is eating the world, or in like something like Annihilation's, in regards to something like Annihilation, it's not eating the world, it's changing the world, which is not subtle.
Arguably is what's also happening in mine.
Exactly. But it's changing to something that's incomprehensible to the characters. But then reading that as something that it, like, the characters themselves are not horrified by, or you, like, the text itself is not horrified by, like, kind of blew my mind. And I would love to know if you can think of, because I don't know if I can, any other media that takes a theme from another genre, or a theme that tends to be from another genre, and completely like spins it on its head.
Oh, I'd have to do a lot of thinking. I'd have to do some preparation and study for that.
Think about that. Yeah, we don't have to answer that right now. Yeah. What were you gonna say?
So in then when I'm saying that it's not horrifying, I'm not saying that I don't explore it, because I do.
Oh no, you definitely do.
But I'm saying that the fact of it is not what is upsetting the characters. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, one of the main characters, like, his concern it's like when he's like, oh, the darkness is here. The darkness was always going to be there. Like he knew that. His concern isn't that the darkness is there and they're all going to die, because everyone's suicidal. But his concern is about what it may mean in like a much different sense. And it's not like I'm scared this darkness is taking, it's like making things incomprehensible. It's, oh no, this is here, which means something much more tangible that may have a negative effect in my life may also be here. And it's like something that I keep exploring, but there's not really anything in the text that is just like, the fact of this is horrifying.
In most cosmic horror usually ends up with a character who doesn't know the thing is there, discovers the thing, and is usually like driven mad by this knowledge. That's a pretty basic summary of what a lot of cosmic horror boils down to.
Nobody
it's like not, it's just like not what happens in your story.
And
I love that.
Goes like, well, my sanity has left the building. No, they're just like, okay.
Sounds good.
This might as well happen.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so kind of jumping off from that, we've talked a little bit about how we tend to conceptualize. Since you're not telling cosmic horror, what kind of stories are you telling?
So the literal actual genre that I'm writing in is sort of new. It's not like new, but it's not been popular because it is essentially high fantasy, but in an urban fantasy setting.
Yeah.
It is distinct from urban fantasy in many, many ways. And we don't have to get into it because I've read many articles online of people kind of trying to find a name for this. So sort of the first example I can think of that went fairly mainstream that sort of did this is probably The Dark Tower.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of it takes place in the city, but it's a lot of genres at once.
It's a lot of genres. The Dark Tower, we can talk about that a little bit later about like breaking genre conventions, because The Dark Tower is just a Coke binge in a book.
Another example is the Netflix movie Bright that everyone hated, which, listen, it's not a good movie, but sometimes we just want to have fun.
Yeah.
I did have a little bit of fun watching that movie.
It's a movie that exists that we can definitely talk about.
I don't think there's much to talk about. Like, you watched it and you had maybe 6 or 7 thoughts and then you moved on with your life.
Yeah.
But like that idea of we're in the modern world, but it's high fantasy.
Yeah.
You know who else did this? Winx Club.
Ooh, you're right.
It was a high fantasy, totally magical world that was also high tech.
Wow, you're so right. I also, Artemis Fowl does a lot of that as well.
Yeah, and I wouldn't know that because I hate that book.
I do have a soft spot for some Artemis Fowl.
And I love that for you. I tried to read it once in 5th grade and went, wow, this boy is terrible. And I put it down.
I'm going to be real, and you know this about me. My favorite characters in everything are the characters who are objectively the worst to be around. Every single character I go, that's my comfort character, is like obnoxious, a know-it-all, should be punched in the face. And I go, I love them.
My favorite characters are the dubiously queer supporting cast.
Yeah. You know what's even better is when those two cross over. We should get more. No. I was gonna say we should get some more queer,
dubiously queer, insufferable side characters. No.
Yeah, I want them. I want them in my life.
Well, you have the Magnus archives for that.
Yeah, like that is just Jarkivist. Awful, insufferable, stays insufferable, and very queer. And I love
Queer
him.
on Maine. So that's
Queer
nice
on
of
Maine,
them.
canonically queer.
What are we talking about? What's our topic right now?
About stories that what stories do you tell?
Got it. So in a genre sense, high urban fantasy, but not like, I mean, sometimes vampires are there, but like I make up magical creatures. I don't have time for most of the fantasy creatures that exist are European and or anti-Semitic. So in terms of like where I'm coming at thematically and like stylistically, I very much am focusing on the emotions. Shit gets wild with feelings. And in terms of theme, I'm almost always talking about being an outsider from lots of different angles. So in that wild dimensional story, that story is pretty much about being lonely. That's it. That's what I'm talking about there. And I can explore it in 20 goddamn books, like, you know, walk. But then another project I'm working on, something you said earlier, and this is going to tie back in, where I'm talking about theme. Did my brain just delete it? Give me a second.
Oh no.
Theme. Sophie, what are we talking about?
From what you write, and you're talking about the Lyceum story.
Thank you. I'm autistic and possibly have ADHD. My brain reboots itself roughly every 15 minutes. I forgot again.
Oh no. I can't pinpoint it for you. Something
talking
about
Lyceum. I was talking about something you said earlier.
Oh yeah, I don't know.
Fucking. You say some words. I'll get back to it. Did you ask me a question?
Can I ask you a question?
I said, did you ask me a question?
No.
What kinds of stories it's about being? Oh, so in this other story, that's not the weird, wonky, dimensional one, but theoretically could be considering the rules of the other universe. I am talking about police brutality against the other and state-sanctioned violence. But so what I'm doing in this story is the emotions are like the text. I don't like how horror, there it is. Earlier, we got there, you said how horror is sometimes about grief, right?
Yeah.
And it's approaching grief in a thematic way more than anything else. I don't do that. I approach topics in a thematic way. Like I could not bear to write a story about police brutality that takes place in the real world. I don't have that kind of energy. I know I'm all miscellaneous in the face, but I am Black and no thank you. So I've put it in a fantasy setting, but the feelings that are coming out of that, those aren't in metaphor. Those are the text, is the feelings from the stuff that I've sort of made into genre and theme because it hurts too much to look at it directly.
Yeah. Which I think is one of the greatest elements of speculative fiction, period.
That's also kind of a genre I'm writing.
Yeah, is the ability for a writer and audience to engage with things that might not be able, like you may not be able to engage with head on in a different way, in a way that doesn't feel as draining. I know as like an avid horror fan, a lot of the time I get asked like, doesn't that make you feel depressed? And I'm like, actually no, like watching something like The Witch, which I said is one of my favorite films, is objectively a horrifically sad movie. From beginning to end, there's themes of isolation, damnation, just like all sorts of like family trauma, just all sorts of like harrowing themes in that film. But I don't want to say I feel joy, but it's almost a catharsis.
Yeah. So my
Yeah,
experience
and
with horror and with the witch specifically, it's like it's about all of those things. But as you're watching it, the way that the story is told, you're not feeling those things. What you're instead experiencing is the horror of witnessing those things.
exactly. Um, and by the end, when spoilers for anyone who doesn't know how The Witch ends, it's
One
a
of my
very
favorite endings
famous,
in movie history.
yeah, it's a very famous ending when she does join the witches. Every time I find myself like
Yeah, you
smiling,
as the viewer, you're like, I love
like
this for you.
I'm happy for you. I
Because
too
like the situation she was in before fucking sucked.
is objectively awful, and I love me some Black Phillip. He's the best goat in the world, and Robert Eggers said he was a dick on set, and I love that. Black Phillip is a cinematic masterpiece. But yeah, so like for a lot of those things, it provides dealing with, especially Robert Eggers' films. I can rant about. He has two. He's The Witch and The Lighthouse, which The Lighthouse, if you haven't seen it, has my partner's boyfriend Willem Dafoe and everyone else's boyfriend Robert Pattinson in it. Um, um, are like they're very Otto and I, my partner and I, had a really long conversation about how his films are, they deal with themes that are uniquely American in a way that that specifically white Americans have not dealt with. Period. The Witch is a lot, its subtitle is an American folktale, and it deals with the legacy of Puritanism, which is not something. My mother just texted me that said Black Phillip is a psychopath. I did make my mother watch The Witch with me on my 25th birthday.
Black Phillip is a good boy, and he was
He's
right.
a good boy. I love him. And The Lighthouse, among many other things, also deals with queer male sexuality, and some other delicious topics that like it's something that I can watch and get a catharsis from, but I don't have to go. I lived in New England, and I can tell you all of the ways that Puritanism still has a death grip on that region of America. And so I think that whether you engage with those topics in your daily life as well, it does provide something. Mm-hmm. And that I also feel that way about science fiction, fantasy.
You brought up catharsis earlier too, and I mean, there's something pretty unique to like horror and fantasy and sci-fi, where a lot of the time you can give the characters agency against this thing that you're talking about in a way that characters in a real life setting might not be able to have. This lipstick is expired and therefore won't dry, and it's just coming off on my teeth. It's a look though, so here we are. Deeply and profoundly faggy, but it can give characters, you can give your characters the agency and the tools to deal with something that you might not be able to deal with in such a direct way in real life. For example, the Babadook.
Ooh,
but that is my favorite horror movie of all time.
That is
Babadook.
Honestly a perfect film.
Yeah, because it shows what it mostly shows is the not dealing with it. Mm-hmm. But it does it in a way where it turns the not dealing with it into a literal monster. And it is something that what I particularly enjoy about it is that the monster is coming for the kid more than it's coming for the woman.
Yeah.
And even though it is her monster, spoilers for the Babadook, if you haven't
again, a
seen
very
it,
famous horror movie
icon. You're welcome. But like, for example, in my story with the weird dimensional stuff, of course there's police brutality in that one too, and there is literally a scene, spoilers for my story that no one knows anything about, where a police officer is killed in what I think is one of the worst. Like it's actually a way that would kind of freak me out. Like it is a bit horrifying. The way that this police officer is killed is he is kind of only partially dematerialized. What happens is he's merged with a wall. And so the cop and the wall are one thing now. And that one thing is very much not alive. Yeah, you had a visceral reaction to that. This is in the context of me being like, I don't think cosmic horror is anything, and I can't handle body horror, and here we are.
Body horror is my favorite. It made me think of, there's a very similar thing that happens in Annihilation. And
am I just writing Annihilation? Is that what I'm doing? So. I haven't seen Annihilation, guys. Now I can't watch it.
It's super good. And also spoilers for the novella. There is also a character who's merged with a wall. But in Annihilation, in a more what I found truly terrifying is there is a scene where a character, trigger warning just for all sorts of violence, who the basic plot of Annihilation is an asteroid hits, it creates this area that no one knows what's really going on, but the area is spreading. This crew of scientists goes in and they realize that it is rewriting. Basically, anything that enters this area is its DNA is being rewritten to also include DNA of other life forms. So one character becomes a plant.
I hate that.
It's awful. It's really awful. And it also
cosmic horror doesn't get me, but transformation, I can't deal with.
Yeah. And there's a scene, not the plant scene, where a character realizes that he's being kind of rewritten and his crewmates cut him open. And there's some weird, gross stuff that you see. You see his internal organs moving. But later, when the group that you're following during this film comes upon his body, it has split and grown into this wall. So there's body parts, like there's his skull and like his body, but it's all flora and fauna, like growing up. And they have this whole conversation about how he's still technically alive because he's a plant, but he's not alive in the way that we think he is. And that is, I think, your face is like instead of like a big Cthulhu eldritch being coming down, this sort of cosmic horror of like, what is existence?
And see, you know what's wild? That is not where my mind went at all.
Exactly.
And that has nothing to do with why I'm uncomfortable with it.
Exactly. Which I think is really incredible to see how genres can be interpreted. Mm-hmm. Because let's be real, Alex Garland could have been like thinking something completely different, but how cosmic horror is read in the horror community, that is the takeaway everyone has gotten from that film.
Mm-hmm.
And I say everyone, I mean the horror community. I don't know if Alex Garland is big outside of that. He's only written films. He's a spooky dude, spooky British dude.
All British dudes are spooky.
Every single one of them.
Hey, shout out to Prince Philip.
Okay, we're gonna move on.
I wanted to share some good news with the chat.
What was I talking about? Oh, so back to, I'm trying to think of what the original question was. Do you have anything before we sort of subtly change direction, because we're at the hour mark?
Mm-hmm. No, because my memory resets every 15 minutes.
Perfect. I love that for you and for me. Awesome. I want to talk about the difference between stories that we think are successful and why, and stories that we think are not successful and why. Because I know you and I have a lot of opinions on those.
So when you're telling a story. I don't know if anyone has read social contract theory. But like I kind of approach storytelling through contract theory, which is
That makes sense.
when you establish the world, you are entering into an agreement with the audience. So that is what happens. That's the difference between writing something for yourself and writing something that's meant to be shared. Because once you share it, a lot of what makes it art and what the story is happening in the interpretation. It's happening in the way that people receive it more than what you're putting into it once it's out. But what happens with the story that's made for an audience is in your setup, in the way you're crafting the first parts of the story, you're setting an agreement. Sometimes that's in the world building. It's setting the rules of the world. It's, characterization. How are your characters? Now, when you break that contract, a lot, we'll get there in a minute. We'll get there. You're setting up a contract. Let's just all think about it's a contract. When a story is successful, it is because it has not compromised the contract.
Yeah.
So something that I've seen a lot online and that I generally agree with is if nobody saw the ending coming, if everyone is completely shocked by how the story ends, usually it is because your story was not successful.
Yeah.
You want them to be able to figure out how it is supposed to end. And I can add so many pieces of media, but let's just say Marvel and Game of Thrones. The idea that something must be shocking to be good is nothing. It also destroys the rewatchability. If your whole point is to make it shocking, it's nothing, because that's not, people aren't here for the end, they're here for the journey, you fools.
That I do think that's like actually a massive takeaway of like engaging with stories, is that no one people remember the ending, but what do people talk about when they talk about Lord of the Rings? They talk about the quest. They talk about the fellowship and how they grow as people.
Because even though like I've not read the books, the Lord of the Rings movies are arguably 9 hours of walking.
Yeah, exactly.
But what you have with those movies is a buy-in to the journey, because you have a buy-in to the characters. And the story is very, very consistent with its characters. It stays very true to the characters. It stays very true to the cultures it sets up. So once you get to the ending, it ends the way you thought it was going to end. Mm-hmm. Right?
And what I love about The Lord of the Rings is it ends the way that you think it will end in the first book. But those characters have grown. They're no longer the people who set out on this journey. And so you get a satisfying arc as well as the contract that you've made being fulfilled.
And the way that they grow is comprehensible.
Exactly.
You can see how they get from one place to another, and you can see why the narrative is pulling them there. But even then, on the other side of it, and what makes the story so widely... Hi, Pumpkin. What?
My nephew.
My kitty cat Pumpkin. He knows his name, but only when I say it's stupid. He's a himbo, like all orange cats.
He's a good boy.
Part of the reasons that the Lord of the Rings has such a lasting impact is A, the author was writing about things he was deeply, deeply passionate about. That those books are essentially linguistics. But secondly, it is beat for beat. Like it is one of those hero's journey stories. Mm-hmm. And it follows a very, very predictable, very, very done formula, which for some people is not interesting, for some people is comfortable. But the way that it does it, it stays true to itself. It stays honest to itself. It's comprehensible. Shit doesn't just happen from left field. There's not there's clearly where the intention isn't, I'm going to shock you. I'm going... I want you to feel so, like, that's why it's so rewatchable. That's why people have, here's my yearly director's cut rewatch of The Lord of the Rings. I could recite it. I couldn't, but like people are like, I could recite this movie, but I'm still here because of the story.
Because the story, yeah, and I also think that as an example of like a genre, I think that the fantasy genre has grown immensely since Tolkien, given that they were written almost 80 years ago.
Yeah, and they are
Um,
deeply anti-Semitic.
oh yeah, yeah. None of this is
Like most high fantasy. Let's be
like
real.
most
D&D,
fantasy,
Harry
yeah.
Potter.
I mean, yeah. But I think it's also something that like if someone were to ask for like an introduction to the rules of a genre before then seeing how that genre rules can be broken and sort of transmuted, Lord of the Rings is a really great idea. I don't know if I would say read the Odyssey, because I think that even though that gives us the hero's journey, it doesn't always give us the way that fantasy is utilized now, whereas Lord of the Rings really does. And then you can go, so here's how modern fantasy writers, okay, so let's talk about the Dark Tower. Because I think the Dark Tower does this. It is the Dark Tower, hot take. Actually, not a hot take. Stephen King has said this. It's just Lord of the Rings, but spooky. That's quite literally it. The world.
I've only read the first book, and good God, there's a lot of walking.
There's a lot of walking, and it doesn't stop. But he specifically said that like he tried to write the Lord of the Rings when he was 19 and realized I can't write the Lord of the Rings. It's like not the storyteller that I am. And took many, many years between writing books. And it truly, it's like it starts with, we have the good old fashioned meeting of the goddess. We have the journey. We have the fellowship. In this, it's called the quartet. But because he had that foundation of Lord of the Rings, he then could add things like it's a multiverse. It is canonically a multiverse. He makes himself a character, and then kills the character of Stephen King. He invites sort of like new characters that you would never see in Tolkien. So one of the main characters, my favorite character, Eddie Dean, is a heroin addict. And his entire arc is getting clean and dealing with the things that he's done as an addict, which you would never see that kind of sort of moral fallibility in a Tolkien leading character. Roland of Gilead.
In the side characters, though.
You get that in the side characters, but and Eddie is technically a side character, but then you get Roland of Gilead, who is an awful human being from the moment you meet him. You do get in book 4, which is, if you want straight high fantasy, like book 4 is where it's at. You don't have to read the rest of the series. You can just read book 4. You like get to learn why Roland is such a horrible person, but he's not the Aragorn. He's not that person who where the text sees Aragorn and his plight as noble and as the right thing to do, even though he doesn't want to be king, he must.
Which is, and the story is very clear on this, what makes him a good choice.
Exactly. Whereas Roland is also thrust into his position, but instead of taking any sort of accountability or nobility or inviting people in, he just murders everyone. He just kills everyone he meets, and lets people who depend on him die. Which gives you my favorite line in the entire series, which I won't quote here because no one needs to hear more Stephen King. But I think that those are two really good examples of like, and then even since then, because the Dark Tower was the first few books were published in the 70s, fantasy has progressed even further. But yeah, that's my little rant about story structure and how I think the Dark Tower is successful because you know, maybe not how exactly it will end, but you know the kind of tone you're gonna get. It's not going to have a happy ending. Yeah.
And on structure, so as we've talked a little bit about how structure impacts the success of the story. Star Wars, there is something about the original trilogy that is far more successful than any other trilogies. The original trilogy, even just the first movie, very, very, very directly follows the hero's journey. It is.
Oh,
and again, sidebar, the thing about Star Wars, it's fantasy. It's fantasy in a sci-fi setting.
Yeah.
But like, again, it's a very predictable story, but it doesn't feel predictable in the way that it's handled. Because I mean, at the time, it was a very, very new way to approach anything. It's fucking groundbreaking. But then you look at the other trilogies, which are hated. And so when you're thinking about, there's a lot of differences. There's a lot of reasons where many people feel the original trilogy is successful and many people feel the other two trilogies are not successful. And I'll say many people feel, I will say the latest trilogy was bad. It was not successful at anything. I had a lot of buy-in to the prequel trilogy. It was successful for me in a lot of ways and not in a lot of other ways, but I don't revile it the way many people do.
No,
the most recent trilogy, I didn't even bother watching the last movie because, and we don't got to get too into this because I feel like everybody knows, but where the first story, you get the consistency. You get the buy-in. It is clear. It is easy to follow. You don't have to be hugely media literate to follow the path of the characters.
Yeah.
Right. Similar to Lord of the Rings. What we care about is the journey. Like the endings, no one thinks too much about the endings. We're here for the AT-AT fight. Like, come on. We're here for the TIE fighters. Like, it's everything. Yeah. What happens with the prequel trilogy is it doesn't make sense. There's a lot of reasons it doesn't make sense, but if we're just talking about the structure and the buy-in, is what they were trying to do was a reverse hero's journey.
Exactly, yeah.
Where they start someone on the hero's path and watch how that gets turned into becoming a villain's path. Mm-hmm. But the problem is it's not well drawn. It's not well drawn at all because the roots of that are very poorly laid.
Yeah, exactly. For that, I feel like it's that middle part. We see how Anakin could be eventually villainous as a child, but he is a child, so I'm not going to be like, baby Annie, you're bad. Which is a horrible way of saying that. But that, like, everything in between, especially with how hard I feel like they justify a lot of his actions that are wrong. That are absolutely wrong.
They do the rogue cop thing where he goes off and there's terrible consequences and we don't spend any time dealing with it. And that's the thing, is the movie very much sets him up as the chosen one and the hero for 2 movies.
Well, and even in the second movie, when he murders an entire village, there's
there's nothing.
There's no, like, not even Padme, who is a character who is set up as being against that kind of violence, goes, guess I'll still marry you. So like he doesn't learn anything.
And even then, the character assassination of Padme. We don't have to get in, but like the way listen, there's a lot of lineups with what failed about the other trilogies of Star Wars and what failed about Game of Thrones. Which I don't know if we're ready. I don't think we're there yet in the conversation. We're talking about structure. But
I'm ready to talk about Game of Thrones.
We gotta wait because that'll become the show. On that, we've also brought up character, right? So in the first story, look at what they did with Padme. We're given someone who's kind, who is capable, who cares about her people first and foremost, who by the second movie is pretty much a love interest.
Yeah, she has no ties to politics.
Like it doesn't make sense. I don't understand why she likes Anakin. I don't understand their whole deal. I don't understand it. And that's the problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you're writing a romance, even if people don't understand why these characters work, they need to want them to work.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And that's the thing. As I'm watching this romance being built, I'm like, I don't care. Please move on. Or I'm actively disgusted by what I'm witnessing. which disclaimer is sort of how I feel about most heterosexual romances. But it's not just like, I'm queer and it's quirky to hate straight people. It's like they're set up to be extremely heteronormative and are usually abusive and toxic. That's not okay.
I mean, I am someone who during quarantine, I have read a lot of straight romance novels. That has become my guilty pleasure. And I think it's really interesting, like exactly what you're saying is, I read one series, which I won't recommend because it is quite trashy, but it's fun, where the first book is a Beauty and the Beast retelling. So through that knowledge, you root for this couple. You root for them to get through their issues and come together in the end, because that is what a Beauty and the Beast story is. And they do, and they get through it, and it's great. And then book 2 happens, and it's this like it's dealing with all of the trauma that they've incurred through book 1 and how each of them deals with it very differently, to the point where their relationship becomes toxic and the main character leaves the Beast character. And only then because it is a romance series, she does end up with another hottie, as you do. And I remember like Being the Beast is a story structure that means a lot to me emotionally. So I was disturbed by this sort of like twisting it, because so many Beauty and the Beast stories are like, how do you deal with being different people and like dealing with your demons to come together, only for those demons to win out in the end. And for this character, she then grows, becomes a different person through her life experiences. And the next romance I do actually think is a better written romance, because suddenly this character is having to be open with what she needs as well as what she wants. And it was like my mind was blown, because I do like you said, I don't see a lot of, especially in mainstream media, romance is written in such a way where the characters, they're not like faux vulnerable, like they're genuinely vulnerable with each other, which I found quite refreshing.
The thing is, romance is really, 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 really common in stories. People love it. It's like, it's so many, like, it's in most stories romance shows up. And the thing is in most stories, it's quite bad. Because similar to like structurally, if you talk to like romance writers, there's like, they can get whole books on just the romance, obviously. Romance has a structure, right? There's ways to set it up. There's ways to make it make sense. There's ways to get that buy-in. And similarly to every other part of a story, when you're writing a romance, it's not like you need the reader to want it.
Yeah, exactly.
Because if they don't want it, it's nothing.
It's
and
it's so, actively like alienating.
Yeah, it's like, why am I here? Get this off the screen. Please get away from me. Can we move on now?
Yeah.
You don't want any part of your story to have that, but particularly a romance, because that is so ingrained in the characters, and it's probably going to come up in the plot, and like it's going to be a huge part of something.
Yeah.
And I think a pretty common feature, actually, of stories that are not successful is they bungle the romance. Like, or they add one that nobody wanted or needed. Or they add one that's disgusting. Star Wars, but
Game of Thrones. I don't have any animosity towards Game of Thrones. I don't know what you're talking about. I kind of want to leap onto not either Star Wars or Game of Thrones. I would like to talk about Penny Dreadful.
Are you sure?
I am sure, because I think everything that you've laid out about, I think everything that you've said in the last 15, 20 minutes is encapsulated in the 3 seasons of Penny Dreadful. So the first 2 seasons of Penny Dreadful are...
And in my heart, there are only 2 seasons of Penny
Same.
Dreadful.
I literally, if someone is like, hey, is this worth watching? I go, you end at season 2.
That's what I say with Supernatural. Watch the first 5 seasons and pause it 20 seconds before the last shot. That's it. That's the end of the show. Go home.
Exactly. And what I love about Penny Dreadful, for anyone who doesn't know, Penny Dreadful is a conglomeration of gothic horror characters chilling out in London doing spooky things. And so you've got characters like Dorian Gray. You have not Lucy. You get Mina from Dracula. You get Dracula. You get Frankenstein. And then you get you get 2 original characters who I love, who are Ethan, the American bisexual werewolf in London, who, as a character, was written for me. Ethan is like everything I've ever wanted in a character. And Vanessa Ives, played by every goth's girlfriend, Eva Green. She's so good. And what I love is you get all of these stories and you get setups for their characters. So you have Eva Green's character is trying to find her friend Mina, who is run away with a vampire. Very dramatic. As one does. You get Victor Frankenstein, who is dealing with his hot mess of a monster. I do think, and I will talk about this on my podcast, Bodybuilding with Victor Frankenstein, shameless plug, because I think that the first season is an impeccable adaptation of the novel. It's so good. It's so good. And then you also have Dorian Gray just sleeping with all of London. He's just...
Sidebar, it was very hard for me to Hadestown. It was so hard for me.
Reeve Carney, who plays Dorian Gray in Penny Dreadful, plays Orpheus.
The sweetest, goodest, dumbest boy. And I was just like, hearing it, I was like, sure, but then I saw his face and I was just like, I don't know if I can do this, guys.
No, he's incredible. He is severely underrated in my humble opinion.
And sidebar, I could do it. Reeve Carney should have been nominated for a Tony, but that's just me.
I firmly agree. He's incredible. And he's incredible as Dorian Gray. The thing is that he to me, when I picture Dorian Gray, I picture Reeve Carney.
Makes my skin want to crawl off my body.
Exactly. He's disgusting. But in such a charming way, like such a charismatic way. I love watching him. And then you get Ethan, who's a werewolf, being a werewolf. Falling in love with Billie Piper, as we all do. And what I love about season 1 is you get this sort of, you get an encapsulation of the adaptation of the books that they're being based off of. You get an arc of the Dracula story. You get an arc of the Victor Frankenstein story. Dorian gets sort of another arc in season 2. And then Ethan also gets his arc dealing with the fact that he's murdering people as a werewolf and decides to stop murdering people after his very, very Irish girlfriend dies of tuberculosis. She's murdered. And I think it's a really great, like you could just stop at the end of season 1. It's a really interesting integration of all of those stories. I think that they do the original source material justice. And then you also get Vanessa Ives, who has her entire plotline of being possessed. And her dealing with being possessed. And there are many, many themes you can read into specifically Vanessa's possession, which we'll get to later. Season 2 comes around. All these characters are still bopping around. It very much is just Vanessa's story at that point, dealing with, I would say, the legacy of witchcraft in England, which is a legacy. We get Patti LuPone in season 2. What a gem. And then we also get, I think, an interesting development with Frankenstein when we get the female monster as a character. and she is a character with lots of agency. She straight up leaves Victor. And at the end of season 2, some spoilers, Vanessa murders her demon. Like, it's this really great, like, arc for this character. And then season 3 happened. And season 3 hurts me. Like, personally hurts me, because they took these characters who have very specific desires and drives and just went, nah, I don't want that. That doesn't interest me. The female monster that I mentioned earlier has this arc where she begins to, before she's reanimated, she's a sex worker and she's brutalized. So in her reanimated state, she starts murdering men who brutalize sex workers. I think something that we can all agree is a bonus, is a good
net positive.
Net positive. And in season 3, she is demonized, not just by the other characters, but by the text itself. And there is this horrifying scene where, to not have her basically be killed, she goes on this monologue about her dead child. And that is what convinces Victor and Dr. Jekyll, who we'll get to, to let her live. And for me, what her story was before then was women deserving the right to live and the right to agency, full stop. And then suddenly, the only way that she is allowed to maintain that agency is because she's a mother, which is gross in a lot of ways and complete.
But critically, they're not making a statement about that being bad. They're not saying, look at these chuckle fucks.
No, they're
only
saying
caring about her because
they're
they're
right.
The text
says
the show itself
they are right.
says, and they're right.
Yeah, and that completely undermines her entire arc previous to that. I won't talk about Vanessa's arc because it makes
we don't have time for that.
It's really angry, but it does pretty much the exact same thing where it rewrites her entire development. We also get Dr. Jekyll, who is a complete misuse of a character. We get queer baiting and no Mr. Hyde, which I'm sorry.
You can't bring in Mr. Jekyll.
Also, they specifically, I don't know how much of season 3 have you watched? Because it's bad.
I've read season 3.
Okay. So
I saw the reveals and went, no, thank you.
No, it's really bad. And not just because the writing isn't good, it's also incredibly sexist and high-key racist. Which is great. It's great when they do that to your favorite shows. But Dr. Jekyll, I think, is a failure of characterization in a huge, huge way. This show is based in the early 1900s in London. They make it very clear that Dr. Jekyll in this version is a man of Indian descent. That says a lot about how he could be in this position, given that India was colonized by Britain. And guess what? Never comes up again. Ever. It is mentioned in episode 1 of season 3, and it has no bearing on him as a character.
I think, and like that brings up a very critical point here. Is like we've talked about the story structure, we've talked about the characters, we've talked about the themes, but like that, like the rules of the world, also common sense, but like identity, like in characters, the identity of your characters within the world that they're in, with interpersonally, is a huge deal that many white writers think is not a huge deal because they're the default pretty much anywhere they go. And so like there's those just thematic, actually no, that is like, hey, we hate our viewers. But then there's also just the identities. There's the I'm going to introduce this identity and I'm not going to do anything with it or bring it up ever again.
Exactly. I think that season is particularly egregious, given the fact it also makes all of its queer characters straight, which is bonkers, given that, like, Dorian, his entire, like, the one non-deviant thing about him is that he is queer. And it's made pretty, like, he does horrible things to his partners. Let's make that clear.
His deviancy isn't that he's queer, which is like a new idea still.
It's just that he's a bad person.
Yeah.
And what I love is that, like, he has partners who are seen as good people in spite of being queer or because they're queer. Hot take. Angelique deserved better. She was also the first canonically trans character I'd ever seen in a horror production. Which, wow, that show was made in like 2016 or something. Yeah, and I think that Penny Dreadful is a really great example of, they knew the story they were telling. They knew the characters that they had for 2 seasons. And the end of season 2 felt really good. Felt like it was earned. And by the end of season 3, technically, yeah, the end of season 3 was earned, but it was earned by characters that were brand new. They were completely rewritten. The rules of the world were rewritten. The interpersonal dynamics were rewritten. And so as a viewer, you kind of are just like, this story and this story are not the same.
But that, you just brought up a huge thing that I'm about to clip through the fucking floor into the arrows. Earn it. You have to earn it. Everything you put in the story, everything comes back to you. You have to earn it. If you're, whatever you're doing in the plot, whatever you're doing with the characters, whatever you're doing in a romance, earn it. And herein lies, I think, an issue with a lot of very popular stories. And my first thought is the Marvel films is they're just throwing things at the screen. They don't earn it. Which for lots of people, that's not a deal breaker. Like, it's still, they can still be fun to watch even if they don't earn it. Right? Because even then, something being kind of terrible, but you're having a good time. Did it not succeed?
Oh yeah, I think that there's definitely something to be said about entertainment value being an actual value.
Yeah, because hot take, sometimes a story is entertaining.
I mean,
and again, a story that is successful for one person may not be successful for another person. But coming back to earning it, that's kind of the big problem with Game of Thrones. Like, we got a half hour left. We brought a Game of Thrones like 6 times.
This is it. This is the Game of Thrones hour.
They didn't earn anything in the last season. They didn't earn it. And that's the issue.
That I think,
of course, thematically and character assassinations, flipping all the themes, taking the identity stuff and how they were critical to them and just being like, well, we were going to write a story about this thing, but actually the activists are the villains. All of that, they didn't earn it.
I also have something to say. This is a personal feeling. This has absolutely nothing to do with anything greater. This is a personal feeling. My big takeaway from Game of Thrones was that fundamentally, D&D, David Benioff and whatever Weiss, D&D, no longer cared about the story that they were telling. They actually, like, in interviews, made that abundantly clear. And I think a huge element of specifically storytelling is you have to care about the story that you're telling. Because if you're telling it because you have to, or money, or you think it's the story, like it's the shocking story people will want, you're not going to tell a story that has meaning to you or to your audience. And I think at the end of the day, because Game of Thrones has a lot of things in the first 6 seasons that, looking back, I want to change.
Game of Thrones was always racist and always sexist.
Always.
And Game of Thrones, it also was never a perfect piece of media. What it was fundamentally was entertaining and emotionally satisfying, right? Joffrey's death in that show was so satisfying that I turned off the show for 6 months.
Like, that's all I need.
I just went, that's it. That's all I needed. That's why I'm here. It happened. I'm done. Let's go.
It also conveyed itself as telling a story that, the way that the early seasons are set up, you get the monologue in like the first season where Cersei says, you either while you're playing the Game of Thrones, you either die or you succeed or something like that. And all of the big power players die. They die horribly. And they're not rewarded for their behavior. The people who you might think of as underdogs are slowly rising the ranks. So the story that you think is being told is one where power and cruelty might not get you what you want. Maybe that's not what this
the whole theme is breaking the wheel.
Exactly. And I think that's why a lot of people stuck through issues that hurt them personally with the show, because we thought there would be a payoff. And
because that theme was very
from day one.
Hammering it. It was a pretty well-developed theme throughout. Even as shit was happening where like maybe individual moments of the show or maybe episodes or arcs weren't satisfying, that theme was always there. And it was always able to at least pull me through.
Oh, 100%.
And additionally, I'm a character person, and it did give me several characters to care about. And here's the thing. Here's my whole thing about it. Game of Thrones has an incomprehensible plot. The plot is nothing. That show, it's nothing. It's garbage. It's nothing.
Bonkers.
What you care about are the people who are involved in this fucking mess, right? And what they did in the last 2 seasons is they said, these characters are new people now. Forget what you know about them. They're new. We don't know who they are. Here they are. But also, you're not going to understand them anymore because we're not a character show anymore. We're a plot show, which is a mistake when you're working in a show where, the thing that people liked about it, and again, this is what we're talking about in terms of when you're making a art for people, a lot of the art is happening in the interpretation, in the way that it's received. The thing that people are always talking about in the show, the thing that people like about the show, other than like the violence and the dragons, are the characters. People are always talking about the people and how they interact with the world and how they interact with each other. Nobody talks about the plot. Nobody. And so when you get to these last 2 seasons and you're like, actually, this show is about the plot now, you're losing everybody. Nobody's here for that. And it's showing like, and it's something like, yes, when you're making a piece of media, in order to make it satisfying, you have to like, there's something fundamentally collaborative about it when you have a large fan base. Because what you might think this is an okay direction to take into it, if your entire fan base is saying no, you've missed something. And so like that's like, it is fundamentally collaborative. And then another thing is, in Game of Thrones, the actors were all against what was happening in fucking the last Star Wars movie. The actors fucking hated it.
And
it's like they forgot they're telling a collaborative story. You've got what their fans want, which they're totally checked out of. But then the people in the room, the people who have been breathing life into these characters,
the storytelling,
and for some of them who'd been there for 6-7 years, who'd been like the like 6 characters who were in the whole show, like
Who
people
survived
who
the whole thing, yeah.
this show when they were like 13 and they're still on, like they grew up in the show, are saying this is not what my character would be doing.
Yeah.
Like I have grown up, I've spent as much time as this character as I have as
know
myself. I know
yeah.
this person, and the writers are saying, shut the fuck up. The audacity, like the arrogance that you have to be going into, like there's a certain level of humility that you need to tell, like that you like if you're especially an ongoing project, because sometimes you're gonna fuck up, and you gotta own it.
You gotta own it, and you gotta take
the criticisms for the last couple of seasons came in of people being like, why is this plot based now? I don't understand what the characters are doing. Why are they doing that? This doesn't seem like them. And they went like, One
of them literally said themes are for 8th grade book reports.
Yeah, which is
that hurt. As someone who loved Game of Thrones, it like reinvigorated my, like I wanted to engage with fantasy again as an adult, not just as a kid. Like that hurt to hear. Since we've got about 25 minutes, I want to kind of talk about something more positive, because I could yell about Game of Thrones.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about an unsatisfying stories.
Exactly. I want to know about some stories that you found satisfying, that like to you were well crafted and gave you the good.
Trying to think of one that I can talk about in 20 minutes, because I'm very long-winded. Started describing in detail from memory the plot of Dragon Age Origins, a video game, to my dad. I was talking for 3 straight hours, and I got up to, if any of you listening have played the game, meeting Zevran, which is in the first act. Again, this is a 30, 40-hour game, but like I was detail on detail, and then you do this, and then you talk this, but like I can really go into it. What story should I talk about? I mean, my first thought was The Untamed.
I mean, I'm not gonna lie, like it would be easy for us to both just like rant about our personal hyperfixations. It's what we do every time we talk.
Okay. A story that I think is satisfying, that I think I can talk about in 20 minutes. Now The Untamed is the only thing that's coming up. Let's see how we go. So The Untamed is, if you've not heard of it, it's because it's a Chinese television program.
You are the only reason I've heard of it.
Yeah. Which, to be fair, it is wildly popular, and also is kind of the most internationally popular show that China has ever produced, to the point that it kind of put the boys love genre, which is a deeply, deeply, deeply problematic genre, on the map. And now there's like 10 boys love shows coming out in China this year, which is a big deal, because in China, you can't show anything gay on TV. It all has to be, what do they call it, homoerotic subtext, but it's very, very much gay on main. Somebody who works for the Chinese censors is gay and is doing the Lord's work. Like, there is no fucking way. Anyway.
Having watched some of The Untamed, it's very gay. Like, there's
I didn't know it was gay going in. It took me 12 minutes to run out of heterosexual explanations. Anyway,
very gay.
Why it is a satisfying story. It is very, 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 very much a character story.
Yeah.
And it very, very, very much stays true to the characters, because there are parts of the show where the plot is completely incomprehensible. Or I'm just like, I don't know. I don't care what's happening. There's parts of the show where it comes to a complete standstill because that one romance that needs to happen because of the plot, but nobody cares about is happening. And I'm like, dear God, do I need to watch this? The reason it's satisfying is because you buy into the characters very, very quickly. For me, The Untamed does an incredible job at making you care about characters quickly. So even when this is a character that's just showing up for a quick arc or something, it's very good at finding, like, here's your buy-in to this character. Here's why you should care about this character. It does a very good job of that. So even though the first episode is completely incomprehensible, the first episode is not that bad if you speak Chinese.
If you
If
speak
you
Chinese,
don't
yeah.
know any Chinese, it is nonsense. It is very hard to follow, because of the way it's translated is bad, but also it's very difficult to translate because they are introducing a lot of characters. And for this is a xianxia, so it's wuxia, but it's high fantasy. So it's martial arts, but magic on main. And it is that, I mean, that's what the show is about. It's magic. Some people do some magic. Some people do some dark magic. People die. It sucks. 16 years later, we're trying to fix the world. That's it. That's the show.
The first episode also throws like everything that you're going, like it tells you this is what you're going to experience.
So,
like real fast.
This is a show that's very narratively interesting because the first 2 episodes, there are 2 story arcs of this show, which are 16 years ago and 16 years later. It's really the 16 years ago story arc takes place over roughly 3 years, so it would be 13 years later. But the plot, and I think censors needed the boys to the later characters who come in who are teenagers, who are babies at the time of the previous arc, needed them to be like higher teenagers so they could show them doing violence. But anyway, the first 2 episodes take place in the 16 years later story arc. So it's literally in order. Episode 33 is, if you're watching it, that's where those are in. And then you are dropped into a 30 episode long flashback of everything that happened that led us to the world we see in these first 2 episodes, which is bleak. And so it's one of those things where you need those first 2 episodes for the next 30 to hit. Because in those first 2 episodes, they're telling you who's dead already. They're telling you lots of things. And you meet like, for example, the main character's sister, you meet her after knowing that she does not survive this arc.
Yeah.
And so, again, the emotional stakes, they come in right in here. Everybody's dead. Everything is awful. Nobody's happy. These 2 characters just hate each other. And I'm going to tell you why.
Yeah.
And so then it tells us why. And we get an arc in the past, which is sort of like the good guy turning into a villain. It's almost Darth Vader-y, except for, you know, the in the show, you're always morally on the side of the character who has become this villain for everyone else. And that's another thing it does well. It is thematically very strong and very consistent. Because thematically, it's pretty much talking about good and evil. What is good and what is bad, that's it. It's a very simple thematic setup, and it has that through line, even though you've got these 2 very different storylines and very different time frames. Because the past story is fundamentally a tragedy. And so with the buy-in to the characters, with these emotional stakes that it does very well, even when the plot, when it's like, I don't know or care what's happening, and like you're trying to figure out all the weird lore, like none of that really matters, because what they're focusing on is the emotional impact, is the reaction, is, you know, there is something that Sophie hasn't gotten to yet, because I mean, if I watch the show, there is a great tragedy that befalls the main characters, and they sit with it. This show sits with this grief for 3 unbearable but wonderful episodes. It lingers on the emotion. There are consequences in this world. There are consequences to your actions. And when they get those consequences, they suffer and it hurts. And we see it hurting them for a long time. And this is also something that is uniquely able to be done in the way that China just approaches a TV show, because it is a 1 season long, 50 episode arc. They do the whole show. It's not like, oh, will the next season get greenlit? No, they said, here's the story we're telling. It'll take us 50 episodes. And they said, okay. And then they released the whole show over like 3 months. They were releasing like 6 episodes a week at one point. It was wild. But anyway, I'm rambling, getting back together. We've got the characters that we care about. We've got the emotional impact. We've got the through lines of the themes. But and the consistency, but what makes it satisfying, what makes it something that is very, very successful to a lot of people is that because of all this other stuff that they set up, there are things that you are begging to happen. There are things that you're able to piece together. It leaves you all the crumbs you need to figure out what's going on. And once you get there, you're already screaming at the TV like, you idiots, can't you see this is what's happening? And so once you get that, it is so good. Once everyone's finally on the same page, it is so good for 2 minutes. because of its emotional consistency, because of its through line, by the time everybody catches up to what's going on, it is 16 years late. Yeah. And the show isn't like, oh, everything is happy now. The show, like the lead is just like, and he just fucking leaves because he's just like, I can't deal with these people, because it's that emotional through line of, it's, you know, like, it's satisfying, like, yay, everybody figured it out, but also, could you have maybe done that 16 years ago?
Yeah, I think something you said a little bit earlier is that this world has consequences, and that's, from what you're saying, sounds like it stays true through the whole show.
Where even when they figure it out, they're still sitting with the consequences.
Yeah,
they're still dealing with, well, what could life have been like? And also the way that they figure it out, the way that everyone buys into what's happening, is a slap in the face to the other characters. Like, you as the viewer, you're just like, good, finally we're on the same page. But then a second later, the show just walks away from the plot, that part of the plot, completely, because it's like, you as the viewer have known this for a while, and the show wanted you to know that for a while. Gay. And that's part of what makes it so good for me, is that there's things that you're begging for and they happen, and there's things that you're begging for and they don't happen and they can't happen, but you know that they can't happen, and you know why. Like, it's, again, with the whole past being a tragedy, like, it sets up his sister and you care about it very quickly, and you want so badly for her to survive, but you are told in the first episode, I think the second episode, that she's big dead. And that she's been dead. But yeah, it's, again, all those stuff. There's, in my rambling, I've said something, I think.
I mean, yeah, you've detailed why it's a successful story. Like, why.
Cool. Every time I talk about the Untamed, I enter a fugue state, and whatever happens, happens.
Yeah, so we have 10 minutes. How do I word this? Because you are my guest here. I too would like to talk about something that I feel is successful, but you know what I like. So I want to know what you want to hear about.
I don't have any preferences at the moment.
My mind is boggled, and now I have to make a decision.
You're welcome.
That was what I was
trying to make a decision. We could always do 10 minutes on diversity.
I feel like we could do 10 minutes on diversity. I also feel like that is a topic that deserves a full 2 hours.
Yeah, it's kind of its own deal.
Kind of its own deal. And I don't know if you know this, I intend to keep poking you for creative things like these.
Nice.
So I feel like what do you want? Like, so what would you like? 10 minutes on diversity? Would you like 10 minutes of successful story? Or do you just want to leave? Are you done?
I want 10 minutes of uncomfortable silence. I want us all to sit here and just, no one can leave. and no one can say anything. No, I do. I want to hear about a story that you thought was successful. I don't want to hear about Frankenstein.
Oh, oh, that hurts.
Yeah,
Wow,
that's
that
our
just,
parameters.
damn, that just
You
like
have a
like
podcast for Frankenstein.
it's a great book. Okay, okay. That's okay. I'm trying to think of something that I can talk about in 10 minutes.
I mean, listen, I did The Untamed, so anything's possible.
I'm trying to think. So many of my favorite films are Frankenstein adaptations. So
Yeah. Can you even think of anything you like that's not a Frankenstein adaptation?
um I don't know if I can talk about it in 10 minutes, but I am going to I don't think I can talk about it in 10 minutes. I wanted to talk about an Ember in the Ashes series because it's
That's what I thought you were gonna say. Please talk about Ember in the Ashes.
so good. If you haven't read it, it's a high fantasy series by Sabah Tahir, who is probably my favorite author right now. Especially my favorite author who is still producing work. Because we all know I would die for Octavia Butler.
And you're right.
So that series, I think it was emotionally devastating. I think it does a lot of what you were describing with The Untamed. It's a linear story path. You do get a third character POV later in the series that jumps around because he's immortal and has been around for a minute. But I think so there's three main point of view characters throughout the series, and they all have drastically different desires and arcs. We have Laya of Sarah, who is born into what is the slave class of this world. And she has two goals. One, rescue her brother from prison, and two, destroy the empire. What a mood. And her goals over time, they don't, those two goals don't like go away, but she's a character who in saving her brother and destroying the empire realizes that there's another big bad that she feels she needs to like also decimate, and that's the King of the Jinn, who I do not have time to talk about his storyline because he is everywhere. We have Elias, who every character named Elias is an idiot, including Elias Viturius. And most of his arc does have to do with the politics of the world, but is very much a familial arc. His mother is, for lack of a better word, a fascist. But he was raised not in this community, so he has like a lot of, and she's also tried to kill him on more than one occasion. Like that's also part of it. So his arc is a lot more about like dealing with #mommy issues, and how his issues with his mother, because his father is big dead, reflect a lot more in regards to the wider world. He then is the love interest of Laya, and he, in trying to prove that he loves her and to save her, dies and becomes the person who sends ghosts to the next world. But he is bound to what's called the waiting place, and his whole arc is basically like dealing with the fact that he didn't know how to love in a way that was open and honest, and it hurt people. And then there is Helene Aquila, who is the Blood Shrike, aka the right-hand man to the emperor, the bad emperor, like the person
Is
that
there
you're
an
not.
emperor who isn't bad?
No. And her whole arc starts with basically her being pushed into nationalism. Not for like, the thing is, like, all of and the thing I really like about this series is the text tells you specifically that Helene Aquila, you understand why she makes these choices. They are never right. And the text does not agree with her. And I think that is something that is really, really important, because while you can say, yeah, man, I'm getting your point of view, I understand why you're doing this, you are never justified. And then as the audience knows she's not justified, she then learns why and how all of her actions were wrong and the systems that have created those actions. And there's 4 books in the series, so obviously this is not comprehensive, because I haven't even talked about the Nightbringer. But what I really, really loved about the final book, I think the final book also is just the language used is stunning. That's the one thing about.
Dude, I could write a fucking essay on the language in the Untamed too. Like,
yeah, she really. There are some moments where I actually just cried at the sentence because it was just so lovely. She is an impeccable writer. But all 3 of those point of view characters get satisfying arcs, but they don't just get satisfying arcs for themselves, they get satisfying arcs within their world. So there are things where, so Helene, I think she's an interesting character in that she doesn't get a happy ending, but she doesn't get a bad ending because she doesn't deserve.
Yeah, I mean, there's this sort of thing where people are always talking about happy ending and sad ending. There's the satisfying ending is what matters.
And right? I think, each of these characters, whether or not, because a lot of their desires and the things that they're going for in book 1, they either get and then lose, or they never get because it is impossible for them to get. And their ending is incredibly satisfying because you know how they've gotten here. And even though you can feel it, I remember the last few chapters, I felt like I was reminiscing with old friends about where they went wrong. And I thought that was really, really moving and really, it stuck with me after finishing these books.
And then I have a question, because while you're talking about the end, something I'll say about the Untamed is it doesn't tie everything up in the end, but it does such a good job with the characters that you kind of can trust that they can take it from here.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And is that the kind of thing you get?
Yeah, all of the characters now basically have a new station in life. But we don't get this is how their life is going to look going forward, but we do know that from what they've learned, they can go forward. But I also think that something that fantasy is guilty of is giving you that epilogue that you don't need. And I think that this series tells you they're going to be okay without you. You don't need to know.
Untamed also does that very well. Even in the ending that aired, which is garbage and makes no sense. The canonical ending is on YouTube. Censoring! Anyway, they had a no home in the ending. But yes.
Yeah.
I love that. They can take it from here. Even if I, as a viewer, even if I want really bad for you to give me more, I don't need it.
Exactly. And that's how I felt finishing that. I was sad because I was putting these characters away that I loved so dearly, but I knew that in their world they would continue just fine. maybe not just fine. Like they all should go to fantasy therapy.
Oh God, I have read one book that has ended with the main character getting a therapist. It's oh God, that very problematic. Rainbow Rowell. Her book,
The
it's
Harry
that
Potter.
one fantasy book. Yeah, the Harry Potter book, but it's like cathartic to read. Still devastatingly white. But
I mean, it's a
at the
rainbow.
end, the main character is like, and I got a therapist, and he's talking to his boyfriend. And he's like, I think you should get a therapist too. And his bitchy posh boyfriend is like, gross. But he's like, no, she thinks I have trauma. And I'm like,
You know. I feel like that is also something we could have an entire 2-hour conversation about is trauma in
yeah, I
storytelling.
was gonna say just list out characters who need therapy and why.
That would be a 2-hour list. Well, it
We
is
wouldn't
8
even need to
o'clock.
say it, we just start saying their names.
Characters, just yeah.
Get thee to a therapist. You know how many plots? This is I know we're at the end. The pet peeve I need the world to know. How many plots? How many, like, I hate a dummy plot, but how many plots could, like, where nothing would have gone, somebody just fucking went to therapy? Like, go to therapy. Like, if you're writing a fantasy world, you can write a world where therapy is accessible in the same way that you can write a world where violence against women isn't an epidemic issue.
I agree. Well, with that, I am going to bid you adieu and say thank you for chatting with me. I plan on having you again and also just talking to you in real life. Is there anywhere that you want people to go find you?
No, don't look at me. I'm a ghost.
Perfect. Then we're done.
All my social media is on private.
Perfect. Okay, I love you very much, and I will talk to you tomorrow. Bye. Thank you, everyone.